Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Prideful Narratives, where we meet inspiring people from across the 2S LGBTQIA+ community and hear about their extraordinary accomplishment and resilient journeys. I'm your host, Moakel, he, him pronouns, and today I am beyond excited to bring you a conversation that I know will inspire and empower you. We have an incredible guest who is making significant waves in his latest published book titled Same-Sex Attraction Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy, focused on sharing awareness about the harmful impacts of conversion therapy. It's my pleasure to welcome Lucas Wilson, who is an SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Toronto Mississauga, and was formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation Postdoctoral Fellow at University of Calgary. He is the editor of Same-Sex Attraction Survivor Story of Conversion Therapy, and he's the author of At Home Within the Holocaust, Postmemory, Domestic Space, and the Second-Generation Holocaust Literature, which received the Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award. His public-facing writing has appeared in the Advocate, Queerty, LGBTQ Nation, and Religion Dispatches, among other venues. He is currently working on two interrelated monograph projects that examine evangelical homophobia and transphobia in the US. It's an absolute honor to welcome you, Lucas.
Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
It's my honor. So I'll be introducing a little bit about your book, and we can take it from there.
Cool.
So Lucas' Same-Sex Attraction Survivors Stories of Conversion Therapy book is an edited collection that brings together the experiences of those who have been subjected to queer conversion therapy. It is an effort to expose conversion practices for what they are: pseudoscientific, bogus, ineffective, and wildly traumatic, and to recognize and listen to survivors with contributions from Gregory Elsasser-Chavez, Chaim J, Levin, Lexie Bean, Syre Klenke, and many more from across the LGBTQ+ spectrum. This is an attempt to ensure that what happened within these pages cannot and will not happen to future generations. I'm so excited to be hearing more about this book, and thank you again for sharing it with me. I finished it in 2 days because I was so inspired by the stories. Each chapter gave me a lot of positive energy. I'm like, if these people went through all of this and they are able to succeed and live the true authentic selves, there's nothing to stop me. I should be grateful. And I was so inspired. I kept reading and getting motivated. So I really appreciate the book and for sending it with me. And I can't wait to hear more from you.
Amazing. I'm super pumped that you enjoyed it.
So Lucas, guide me behind the thought process of creating this book. What inspired you to compile these stories?
So the book came about actually. I was invited to publish it or invited to edit it. I was actually at the STI clinic doing a routine STI check, and I got a message on Twitter, and my soon-to-be editor said, "Hey, I read your work online, and I'm curious if you'd like to edit a book." And for those outside of the book or sort of writing industry, this is not a common experience. It's in fact, you're always the one as the author to send out your manuscript to an editor. So when an editor comes to you, it's super exciting. And for me, I found out that this is much more in line with British publishing, and oftentimes, the publisher will reach out to the individual author. And in the US and Canada, this is just not a thing. So I was super honored. I was super excited, and I submitted then a proposal based on what I had been told they were looking for. We negotiated a wee bit about, what exactly would be included and what wouldn't be included. And from there, I went out and started soliciting submissions from a number of folks, just mostly based on social media and my networks, and asking people to reach out to folks who they knew had undergone conversion therapy, or those who had undergone conversion therapy themselves. And I had a number of submissions. From there, you kind of weed down the number of stories that you're going to include, and you choose the ones that you think fit best with the collection. And from there, you work with authors over well, a period of a number of months, and you have to work pretty closely with each individual author, and ensure that what they're putting forward with their writing is in line with the type of collection you're looking for. Not to say that you change the content of their story, but instead you really focus their stories on what the collection is aiming to reveal and to give voice to. And so worked with authors for a number of months. Some authors you work with just a wee bit and their stories are already, in shape for the collection. Others we had to work a little bit, longer. And it's honestly a pleasure to work with authors and to, hone their stories to get them to where they, to the best story that they can write. And once that's done, then there's, a number of other sort of editing processes that for me, this was my second edited collection. My first edited collection was an academic collection. So this one being in the creative world was a little bit different, but nonetheless, you learn so much as you're going through it, and found out a lot about publishing. I found out a lot about editing as I was going, and worked with the publisher. And then from there, you submit everything, and then that's kind of it. And from that point forward, you work on marketing and promoting the book and whatnot, which is a very weird process because it's a thing that does not come naturally. I don't know necessarily how to promote my creative work, but it's been a fun, crash course over the past few months doing this, and I'm excited for everyone to have the book in their hands.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for sharing. It does sound to me magical. Like you attracted this opportunity while you were at the Syre Klenke, it came to your door, and you didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle, but throughout the journey, you were able to slowly gather the pieces and manifest the work into this beautiful and inspiring book that I can't wait for the other viewers to read it. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
So moving on, how did you approach survivors to contribute their experiences, and how did you handle the difficult discussions and the trauma that survivors experience?
Yeah, it's a wild thing trying to put traumatic experiences to paper. And most of my past research was actually in the context of intergenerational trauma. So looking at survivors and their descendants of instances of mass trauma, specifically the Holocaust, and looking at how that trauma is passed on, and also how people communicate that trauma by way of literature specifically. And so I think the thing about literature, or the thing about trauma, is oftentimes that trauma expresses itself in really indirect ways. So it's not that, trauma is necessarily going to say like, hey, here's the pain, here's the suffering, and communicate itself in that way. But oftentimes the psyche tries to protect itself, and the psyche tries to, in some cases, bury whatever happened, the wound, so as to blunt the force of that trauma. And the problem is that pain or that wound will always try to find a way to communicate itself. It's always going to express itself, even if it's in, again, indirect ways. And so working with conversion therapy survivors to tell their stories about what happened to them, sometimes, for instance, when I was first reaching out to people were like, no, it's just like too much for me to revisit. I don't want to go back and bury that trauma, or, to bring that back to light and to sort of examine it and think about it. I just don't want to do it. That's not worth for that. It wasn't worth for those individuals, that emotional labor that is required. And so when in fact you did have someone who was interested in telling the story, but sometimes people were very much like, yep, here's my story, that's it. And just, you move on. Others communicated multiple times that this was not an easy process. And so, whenever you're dealing with writing, whenever you're working with anyone who is submitting their writing, whether it be for me in the past, oftentimes it was through teaching when students would submit their essays or their work, I would, look at their writing and evaluate it. But this, of course, was a very different experience. I was not evaluating in that sense, individuals' abilities as much as I was trying to get them to tell the story to the best of their ability. And so, working with survivors on this collection, specifically in these stories, it was a difficult experience for a lot of people, and for me included, right? Like having to think through a lot of these experiences that, although perhaps my experience wasn't the same as, other contributors, there were a lot of resonances, right? And, What happened to me was very similar to others, and what some experienced, behind closed doors or in that, conversion space. There were a lot of commonalities, and so I remember specifically just thinking of one contributor. He was writing about how whenever he would shower, it was a moment of anxiety for him, because what conversion therapists and evangelicals, more broadly, communicate to young people specifically is that watch out for temptation, avoid temptation. And when you're showering, you're naked and you're touching yourself. And so people, immediately start thinking, oh gosh, well, if I touch myself, then I might become aroused and then I'm going to masturbate. So this story, he includes, he talks about this specific reality. Well, I hadn't thought about this in years. I mean, I left my faith a long time ago. I'm no longer a person of faith, and I have no desire to return to any faith. And I'm very much, comfortable in the non-religious world at this point. But when I was reading these stories, it brings up these memories, right? It brings up these things that you don't remember, or maybe your brain is trying not to remember. Maybe this is my brain trying to protect me from thinking about things like that. Where I remember, you're showering, doing something that is commonplace, as you sort of quotidian or daily, that everyone does, and that action of doing something that, like how most people start their day, that was a site of anxiety. That was something that was constantly worrying me, that I was going to do something that I quote unquote shouldn't. And I had learned this from both, again, my conversion therapist, as well as the wider evangelical world. And so working on these stories, it's very difficult to sort of rehash these experiences for those individuals, but it's also difficult to think about these experiences as they relate to your experiences as the editor. And so for me, it was a wild experience. It was also, having Zoom chats with some of the contributors, not everyone, but some of the contributors. We would have chats about the writing, and we would talk about these things. And when we would talk about it, inevitably the difficulty of writing these stories came up, right? And so I think that putting together a collection like this as the editor, but also for the contributors who are rehashing and unearthing these stories from their past, and in some cases not so distant past, right? These are recent experiences. I think can be quite difficult, but everyone who was included in the collection was at a place in their life where they were able to think through these and feel through these stories as they wrote them.
Thank you so much for sharing. I did notice while reading the chapter that the survivors were on different stages of their healing journey. Some of them made peace, some of them still remember. And of course, I also felt triggered while I was reading them because they were heavy. Some stories were unimaginable. Like the case that you mentioned about showering, I remember they forced him on a chair and they were pressuring him, and he felt some numbness in his hand and tingling, and they told him, well, because you've been using your hand for bad things like masturbation, which is very normal, but they made him feel like he's a sinner, and then his hand is acting against him, the demon is leaving his body. I remember a lot of cases, like another person who had to smell some feces in a jar, and he had to hide it in his backpack in the closet, and it's just so dehumanizing. So I felt a lot of rage. I myself also don't identify with any religion anymore, because although I haven't experienced the harmful impacts of conversion therapy directly, but I've been rejected by my community and my society in the name of religion, which was very hurtful and painful. So I'm more spiritual, but I can associate with the pain of these survivors, but I was also very inspired by their resilience. And you mentioned trauma. Of course, it does manifest in the body in different ways. Sometimes it doesn't show, but it can manifest in the body as some sickness, some chronic illnesses, some shoulder pain, neck pain, stomach aching. And also, of course, some mental health challenges such as PTSD, high anxiety, or being isolated. So it's very tragic, but at the same time, you were able to create the safe space, this judgment-free zone where they were able to trust you and share with you these stories. And I do believe there's a healing power in sharing your stories, in narrating what you've been through. And also, it's a self-reminder that you've been through this and you're still here, you're still doing great, you're still thriving. So it also reaffirms about your courage and resilience as a human being. So well said.
Yeah. I think that, even what you were saying, like how the body keeps the score, right? Like your body communicates these things. I think that what a lot of queer people experience, even if they didn't go through conversion therapy, there's a lot of parallels to what happens in conversion therapy and what happens outside of conversion therapy for queer people specifically, right? I oftentimes think of conversion therapy really as a concentrated form of homophobia and transphobia. And for those of us, for folks who didn't go through conversion therapy, for folks who, but nonetheless lived in, homophobic contexts, whether it be religious or otherwise, that there are so many similarities. And I think that, in the book, in the introduction, I talk about that, I don't even love the term conversion therapy, but it's obviously the most culturally recognizable term to describe or to name what we're naming and what we're representing in the collection. More so, I prefer the term, which is a newer term, and it's a term that's coming out of Australia and the research being done there, conversion practices. So not conversion therapy. Obviously, conversion therapy is not therapy and there's no conversion. But I think the idea of a conversion practice and getting rid of the language of therapy, even though conversion is still in there. But again, there's never a perfect term, whatever. But thinking about conversion practices more broadly as those which are attempting to change an individual's sexual orientation, one's gender identity, and or gender expression. And so for queers, for those who didn't go through conversion therapy, it doesn't mean that they have not been subject to conversion practices, right? Like when a little boy who's more stereotypically feminine, pardon me, or a little girl who's more stereotypically masculine, sits in a certain way or talks in a certain way or acts a certain way, when his or her or their mom or dad corrects them and says, don't sit like that, uncross your legs or cross your legs or whatever it might be, these are what we call conversion practices. These are attempts to change an individual's gender identity expression, and in some cases and oftentimes their sexual orientation that is oftentimes associated with these things. And so I think that for you, when you're saying, there are certain resonances, it only makes sense because I think that so much of what we find in conversion therapy is really just the concentrated form of societal and cultural and religious homophobia and transphobia that finds its expression outside of these spaces.
I agree with what you said because although I didn't go with what they call conversion practice, thank you for correcting me with the better term. But yes, like I did experience homophobia in its different forms. Like when people tell me, stop moving your hands a lot, or your voice is too soft, or you're being a little feminine. So, of course, these are like microaggressions that affect you. And it's like fighting your own true authentic self. Like, that's how I am. You have to accept me. You don't try to change me. So, of course, it's manifested in different forms. But again, homosexuality is not a sin, what people call. I feel like they used to say homosexuals are sick, but I would say homophobia is the actual mental sickness that needs to be treated. And I know in the book it was mentioned that the conversion ideology, which is the term first used in Chris Saps et al., that mentions Suji CE survivor statement, names the belief and teaching that frame LGBTQ2S plus individuals as incomplete, broken, sick, and or degenerate. But that's why the book that you made is sharing a lot of awareness to show that no, we are whole, we are complete, we are resilient, we are successful, we're doing wonders in this world despite all the darkness and the tragedies we've been through, and we're still here to exist.
Absolutely.
So I did like what you said in your book that it was created to stop these harmful conversion practices from happening in the future. Where are we at now in this righteous battle?
Nowhere close to where we should be. I think, this book, as well as any other book about conversion therapy written by survivors, is obviously in part an attempt to see an end to these practices, to do their best to rid the world of these evils. It's not doing what we want it to do, and it won't do what we want it to do, if just to be frank and to be honest. Yes, that's the goal. Yes, that's the desire. And I think that we should always have that desire. We should always make that our goal. But the reality is that there are homophobes and transphobes out there who want our demise. And part of, even what I bring up in the introduction, and it's something that I really emphasize for as much as I possibly can, is that people conversion therapists or conversion practitioners, however we want to use, or whichever term we want to use, them along with those they represent, oftentimes religious communities, because conversion therapy disproportionately affects those in religious contexts, specifically Christian contexts, that their goal, right, that their desire, their aim in doing conversion therapy is to erase the world of queerness. That is to get rid of us, which definitionally is what two scholars I esteem very highly, Christine Robinson and Sue Spivey, they refer to as genocidal intentions, right? That if these conversion therapists and those they represent had their way, we would not exist. They want us off the face of this planet, and they want all queerness and expressions thereof erased. So I think to myself, when, is this book going to change these people? No. I mean, even a few days ago, I was on Blue Sky, Twitter's replacement, and someone tweeted after I had posted about the book, that they wish that there were more conversion, what do they call them, like conversion centers, or I don't know what the term they use. And I retweeted it like that. Like my supporters really love me. Obviously, he wasn't a supporter. Obviously, he didn't like me. He has since, I think, either deleted his tweets, has been kicked off, or has deleted his account. I don't know. I went to find him actually today, and I couldn't find him. Anywho, this is the thing, right? Like, he's one of many people who are at least being upfront, right? Like, a lot of people say, like, oh no, that's not what we want. We don't want, you gone. We don't want you like not here. We just don't want you to be queer. It's like, so in other words, you don't want me to be here, right? Like, it's like saying to a woman, I don't care that you're I want you to be here. I just don't like that you're a woman. Mm-hmm. That individual would say, but I am a woman, and that's who I am. Therefore, you don't want me as me. Therefore, you don't want me. And it's the same with the sexuality and gender identity and expression, right? That for me, I am a queer man. I always have been and always will be. And for someone to say that they don't want my queerness is to say they don't want me. And there's no two ways around that. And so I hope that this book, again, does these things that, rids the world of this hatred, but it's not going to, and it never will. Mm-hmm. But at least it gives some folks who perhaps are thinking through these issues, who are considering, even if they want to go through conversion therapy, or if they want to put their kid through, if they ever were to somehow find this book in their hands, that I hope that this book would do its part in changing those minds. Again, a small minority, but a minority that is whose minds are still worth changing. If we're not just thinking about, cultural representations, or in this case, literary representations of conversion therapy, we're thinking perhaps more broadly and thinking about, the legal aspect, or, how conversion therapy has been outlawed in certain places across the world. For those of us in Canada, conversion therapy is outlawed, and that is not just a ban that is protecting minors, it's protecting literally everyone. And some people, have made the argument, well, shouldn't people be able to decide if they want to put themselves through conversion therapy? Conversion therapy, of course, is a practice that has been identified by the UN Rapporteur as torture. And it's been, it's definitional abuse. And so, no, people shouldn't be able to subject themselves to abuse. People shouldn't be able to subject themselves to torture. So in Canada, this is, something that has been outlawed. In the US, I think it's like 22 or 23 states plus DC and a few, municipalities have outlawed conversion therapy for minors specifically. And it's not a nationwide ban, and it's not protecting all folks, adults included. And so that leaves the door open for these folks to continue to practice conversion therapy in those contexts. And so even still, right, like even if like the US were to have a nationwide ban that was protecting adults, people oftentimes will say, well, isn't that great? And look at the progress we're making. It's like, sure, we're making progress, and we're so thankful for the progress being made, and we're thankful for those who have worked tirelessly to make nationwide, or in some cases, statewide or municipal bans. However, like all crime, it will just simply go underground. Just because it's illegal, just because it's outlawed, doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. And so for a lot of people, they celebrate, and they should celebrate. However, the reality is that it's something that will continue to happen, regardless of books like this, regardless of laws passed, simply because homophobia, unfortunately, is here to stay.
So, as you mentioned, you clearly depicted it, that it is the genocide. They are trying to erase us, erase our identity, and your experience, unfortunate experience on Blue Sky, did prove that homophobes are still there. They're still wishing that this tragic centers, despite all the scientific research that it doesn't work. They still want it to be there. They still believe they need to change us somehow or erase us or sometimes extremely to kill us. So it is still there. And as you said, we are still in the early phase of our righteous battle. But the work that you're doing, the book that you're doing, these people sharing their stories is like part of this fight that will inspire others. And I know, like in some cases, people don't want to go to these conversion practices. They are pressured, they are forced. I remember one of the stories where a little child was taken by his father. They traveled on a plane and then they put him in this center and he was like shocked. And the father was like, if you don't fix yourself, you're not my son. And they instill these feelings of shame. Like it's like I noticed like a common theme was shame throughout all these survivors. And also like some countries did ban it or it's considered now illegal. But unfortunately, there's a lot of centers where they still do it secretly or under the table. And the harm is there. Sometimes it's tremendous amount of self-pain and self-hatred that is inflicted from these practices, and it takes many, many, many years to heal yourself. But if the stories showed anything, that no matter how extreme these conversion practices are, nothing works, and at the end of the day, people did embrace their true authentic selves and emerged victorious. So,
Yeah, I think that, even, before you're asking about how the collection came together and putting it together, and I very emphatically asked my contributors to not just at the end of each story put a bow on everything. And there are a few that offer some sort of like narratival resolution, which was not exactly what I was going for or what I was looking for. However, to have a few stories like that, I think is actually important. And my editor really actually pushed me to include a few stories with some happier endings, so as to not necessarily end on such a negative note for every single story. However, my impulse was and my desire was for these stories not to end on a positive note. Why? Because I didn't want people to walk away from these stories feeling some sort of like, oh well, it's fine because he's fine now. Yes, these people are fine now. They wouldn't have contributed to this collection had they not been fine. And this is something I bring up in the introduction, that all of these folks who are writing these stories are at a place in their lives where they're able to talk about this. They're able to, or have been able to come to terms, or perhaps are coming to terms in the present with what they experience. But I wanted readers, when reading these stories, not to feel like, oh, I can just walk away from everything and be okay, and feel comfortable myself. But I wanted them to sit with the uncomfortability of these stories and to sit with those experiences and know, at least second-handedly, what it was like to walk in the shoes of those of us who have undergone conversion therapy. And so, but all that to say, regardless, you're absolutely right. Like the edit or the contributors in this collection, they're all in a place now where they are living, their best lives, living authentic lives, which is wonderful. And I think that is something obviously to note. But again, for those who read these stories, will see that there isn't that narrative resolution throughout, and that very much is an intentional decision.
mm-hmm. I did notice that all these survivors, they were like stronger and wiser and more resilient, despite this tragic experience they've been through. But of course, like it's not the end of the battle. There's still a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of things to unpack. And sometimes the trigger can still be there, but healing is ups and downs, and the journey continues.
100%.
So I did like what you said in this book, in quotations, in ways I never could see in my own story. I witnessed the beauty and humanity within these individuals who were told they were anything but human and beautiful. I found myself enraged at those who fail to accept these individuals as they are, particularly those unable to navigate the nuanced gray areas that define so much of our humanity. This journey not only softened my heart, but also illuminated the profound power of the personal essay, revealing depth I had not fully appreciated in my decade as a creative nonfiction professor. So, were there any specific stories or contributions that deeply impacted you personally during the editing process?
So think all stories in their own way. Again, I think that it's such a common sort of human, if we can, I hate that term, but whatever, such a human thing. It's such a human thing for us to look for similarities and to find what is similar between us. It's also very human and common to find what's different and look at the number of wars and conflicts, and we can see that. But I think for me, reading these stories, and the vast majority of these stories are from evangelical or white Christian fundamentalist or charismatic Pentecostal backgrounds. There's one story that comes from an Orthodox Jewish background. There's one story that comes from a contributor who defines his upbringing as being part of a cult. And there's one I'm bored. There's one contributor who talks about their experience in non-religious terms. They didn't come from a religious background. But the rest are from these conservative Christian traditions. And so reading these stories, it is wild to see how similar so many parts of their stories were to my story and vice versa. And, even if we're to think about the story, from the contributor who doesn't come from a religious background and thinking about their story of their mother trying to change them, and it's through these like sort of emotionally manipulative conversations that they have with their mom that their mother is trying to again change who they are. And that story specifically, I mean, that's really the story that catalyzed the idea that there are more than just one. There are numerous instances and iterations of conversion practices and conversion therapy, right? That it doesn't look like the same thing. It doesn't necessarily match up with, the representations that we see in popular media, like Garrett Conley, who you just read a quote from him from the foreword of the book. He writes the foreword to the book, and he talks about how he sees these stories as beautifully profound, and again offering new insight into his own story. With that, I think that, or with the story about this individual's mom and their mom trying to change them, it just shows you again how capacious or broad conversion practices really are. Right? It's not just for those, or it wasn't just for those who underwent traditionally understood conversion therapy. It's again, the conversion practices are far-reaching, and they affect every if not most queers. And I truly don't know any queers who did not in some way experience conversion practices. But again, maybe I haven't met those lucky few. But I think that all of the stories really again showed me how much all of our stories rhyme, and how much of all of our stories really have a lot of unifying threads, while also showing me the diversity within this experience known as conversion therapy. That unfortunately is possible, right? That there's so many different types and expressions and iterations and instances of conversion therapy that, yes, my experience doesn't match all of them, but there certainly are a lot of, resonances.
I thank you for reminding me about this very inspiring story. You mentioned emotional manipulation, which is an indirect way of conversion practices, and how the mother was having this phone call with the daughter and trying to convince her that she's wrong, what she's feeling is invalid. And to me, that's insane. If someone tells you I'm feeling this way, you should validate their feeling, not gaslight them and make them feel like they are hallucinating. This is very wrong. But I did like that the girl was very firm. She set her boundaries, and she was very convinced with her core beliefs and identity, and trying to live authentically. I remember she shared something on social media, perhaps Facebook, and the mother was like, "Why you shared it there? I don't understand. I can support you, but this is very personal." And she's like, "I'm proud of it. I'm living my authentic self. And if you love me, you have to support me unconditionally." So there was a lot of discussion. There was obviously a lot of emotional manipulation, but I also liked how she was able to set firm boundaries. So
Yeah, I find that, so much of what we're talking about, whether it be conversion practices or beyond, or just homophobia beyond, it's how people make our sexualities, our gender identities and expressions about themselves. I can remember even coming out to certain people and them saying why didn't you tell me sooner? You should have told me sooner. It's oh, sorry, this wasn't about you, right? This has nothing to do with you. In fact, it has everything to do with me. And yet these folks, try to talk about us as if anything about us in regards to our sexuality or gender have to do with them. You can think about, and it also just goes to show you how much people who claim that, queer community, all they think about is sex and sexuality and all these things. It's like how much these folks also think about these things. I actually think that we all think about these things. We all have these ideas and self-perceptions and perceptions of others on our brains. But who are the ones that are out there making it about themselves, even though they're talking about us, they're projecting onto us, when really it's just, communicating their own anxieties about sexuality, gender, and whatnot in public forums. And yet we're the ones who are oftentimes accused of being sexual or oversexed. And I'm not saying that we're not. I think that to claim otherwise is silly. It's an argument that's not worth making. We're all sexual and we're all sexed beings. But so are they, and they communicate that in, again, indirect ways, and it's oftentimes projected onto us.
I totally second that. If I need to come out, it's on my own terms, whenever I'm ready and comfortable, and it's not about you. It's not your choice. It's my journey. It's my decision. So well said. So in the book, you speak about the shame of going through this trauma. What is the key to overcome these feelings of shame and guilt?
I think there are a lot of ways to overcome the guilt and the shame and the anxiety, and for other people, depression or suicidal ideation and beyond, right? Like these negative emotions and self-perceptions. And I think that for me, honestly, I think academia saved my life in a lot of ways. I really do credit actual learning, not the learning I did in church or at Liberty University, which is where I underwent conversion therapy, Liberty University being the world's largest evangelical school. When I went on and did, grad school, I started actually learning real, not a bunch of, religious mumbo jumbo, hocus pocus sort of tomfoolery, but instead started, diving into, theoretical text, primary source text, secondary text and beyond, that really helped me understand myself and my relationship to my sexuality, relationship to my faith, which at the time when I first left Liberty and went to McMaster University for my MA, and then beyond that, Vanderbilt and whatever the subsequent years after that, I was able to really start thinking through a lot of the issues that conversion therapy had created for me. And not just thinking through, but feeling through. I think that, if we are thinking about shame, we're thinking about guilt, anxiety, these are emotions, right? Like these are affects. And these are things that are like essentially intensities of energy, not to get too new agey, but they really are. And these feelings or these emotions I had, I couldn't just, bottle them up or push them down. I had to let them express themselves, right? And I think that goes hand in hand again with trauma, that where you have these long narratives, these narratives that you believed for a long time about yourself, you have to work through those narratives and think through those narratives and deconstruct those narratives and rip them apart. If you're ever going to rebuild, right? Like you can't just sort of build on a shaky foundation. And so for me, academia, I honestly do credit so much of my ability to work through and think through and feel through the past was through study and research. And of course, now that's what I do for a living, and it's great when that works out. it's nice. But I think that that's a big part of my ability to come to terms with the past, and even in that phrase, to come to terms, to find terms or language to articulate what happened, I think is a huge part of that. And again, the emotions or the feelings that you have that are associated with that, you find a way to communicate those as well. But I would say the first and foremost way that I was able to do that was really through academia.
I'm glad that academia was your feeling to self-acceptance and to heal yourself. And as you mentioned, like doing your research, and it's beautiful to know that you're aligned with your purpose and you're now doing it as you're living. And so you're inspiring, you're doing your research, you're healing, and at the same time, you're healing others. So that's very beautiful to hear. And just like to differentiate, I know that guilt is like the feeling of you did something bad, but shame is you are bad. And in this, all these experiences, they were trying to instill this deep core subconscious message that you are yourself diseased, you are yourself flawed, you are wrong, you need to change, or otherwise you'll not be accepted, you are less. Just plain and mere dehumanizing. So it's not easy. It's not easy to overcome all of this. And no wonder why there was a lot of trauma in like in these incidents. But every person has their own healing journey, their own ways of rediscovering themselves and loving themselves and affirming their authentic self. So academia is one great way, and I know survivors also shared other ways. So healing is a personal journey.
100%. You know, and I think that I think with a lot of folks who've undergone conversion therapy, the way that they have tried their best to come to terms with their experiences has been through advocacy, right? And I think a big part of that advocacy is telling their stories and giving voice to what happened, similar to what I've been doing for the past few years and continue to do. And I think that's super important. I think also just finding community, and in a recent Canadian study, the number one cited way of moving forward, or not necessarily moving forward, but coming to terms of working with past, was finding an affirmative community, queer or not. And then the second, most common was finding a queer specific community. And then of course, finding a queer therapist or a queer affirming therapist is also very helpful. Therapy school, it should be, practiced by or, experienced by everyone. But I think that these are other ways that people, work through or come to terms with the past. But oftentimes it is really finding a way to articulate one story and to be heard, right? To be believed and to be affirmed, and as a way to attempt to move forward.
As you said, there's a transformative healing power in finding a supportive community that will embrace you and love you for who you are. So just having this community that hears you without judgment is sometimes all you need.
100%.
So you did mention that you are yourself a survivor of conversion practices, and this led you to be an activist. So are you comfortable sharing your empowering journey with others who might need to hear it the most? I know this might be a little triggering and tough, but if you're comfortable, feel free to share.
No, I mean, I do this, I guess, now for a living, talking about, or at least in part doing this for a living. And, I've shared a few details up until this point. The idea, or the central sort of setting of my conversion therapy experience was at Liberty University, which is located in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's more to say about Lynchburg, but we'll put a pin in that for now, I suppose. But I went to school for my undergrad at the world's largest evangelical university, founded by the infamous Jerry Falwell. I'm a truly disgusting human being who is now dead. And as Bill Maher, not that I take my cues from Bill Maher, but as Bill Maher once said, not all death is bad death. Anywho, so with my experience, I went down there from 2008 until 2012. And all 4 years, I was in the school's conversion therapy program with a man by the name of Pastor Dane Emmerich. And Dane Emmerich is a man who is he's a queer man who identifies as, he doesn't identify as a gay man, but when the proof's in the pudding, maybe you should. But he's for all intents and purposes, a quote unquote ex-gay, someone who's claiming an identity that is, not. And so I met with him for 4 years. And conversion therapy people oftentimes are like super curious about like what was it like to be inside the room, or when you were in a specific room, what was it like? And for me, he was very pseudo-Freudian, right? Like he drew upon some like psychoanalytic ideas, but was really unskilled at using those ideas. And so he attempted to locate the cause of my same-sex attraction, quote unquote, is the phrase that's used in evangelical and conversion therapy circles. It's not that you're queer, it's not that you're gay, it's not that you're bisexual, it's that you quote unquote struggle with same-sex attraction. which is a way of divorcing the sexuality from the individual. It's saying like, oh, you're not gay. You're just a person. You're just a heterosexual who's struggling with this sin. It's like this intellectual sort of like gymnastics that one has to perform. And so with Emmerich, I met with him and he asked me a lot of questions about my family dynamics. So what was it like with my dad, my mom? And the narrative that he was looking for was that my mom was overbearing, which she was, Cheryl, my mom, wildly overbearing. But the other part of the narrative is that I had a really, emotionally distant or absentee father or abusive father, which I didn't. My dad was arguably much more involved in my life than my mom was, and wonderfully supportive. I couldn't have asked for a better dad. And so evangelicals and conversion therapists are not known for their consistency, and so that didn't matter that my dad was wonderful. It didn't matter that did not fit the narrative. What mattered was that part of it fit the narrative, and they were going to go with that. So Emmerich went with, oh, okay, so you got this overbearing mom. Yep, true. So that was really this narrative that he ran with, along with the fact that I'm the youngest of 5 kids. You can actually see on the back of my phone, there's my family there. I'm the baby. I'm the token homo. What's the stereotypical youngest queer child? And so my brothers growing up, those are all wonderful now, but my brothers growing up, they were a bunch of beeholes. So that was, of course, part of the narrative too, that I was, oh, your brothers were not nice to you, didn't fit in the world of men, and you were excluded from them, and you hung out with your sister, which is true. Like, I loved hanging out with my sister, and we played a lot of dress up, a lot of dolls, that kind of stuff. And that, again, fit the narrative. But what didn't fit the narrative was, again, that I was like really good friends with guys in school. My best friend was a guy. But again, what conversion therapists try to do, they try to sort of like turn a blind eye to the things that don't fit their narrative, and they amplify or magnify that which does. So employing this sort of psychoanalytic, again, pseudo-psychoanalytic framework, as well as this theological framework, which of course undergirded the entire practice of conversion therapy at Liberty, Emmerich would constantly try to talk me through, and it was a form of talk therapy, my quote-unquote same-sex attraction. So divorcing the individual me from my sexuality, me being queer, I was instead just acting on this like sinful desire that somehow I had. And so the way to work through this, according to conversion therapist Dane Emmerich, was to fight my same-sex attractions by way of changing my gender identity and expression. So they would ultimately say that it's not that I'm a queer man. Again, I'm a heterosexual struggling with same-sex attraction, but it's that I have a gender identity problem. And the gender identity problem is that before I hit puberty, I was doing the things that girls do. And by the time I hit puberty, I went for what was opposite of me, because it's a very binary system of gender and sexuality. And when I went for what was opposite of me, according to Emmerich, I went for men because I was not living comfortably within the world of men. So the way to change that, again, if your sexuality is not fixed, and you're ultimately just a latent heterosexual, the way to fix that is through your gender performance. So if you are to do the things that men do, you will start not just doing or acting like a man, but you'll become a man, and you'll be, and again, a man in this term is a heterosexual man. And so all I had to do was do the things that men do, talk like men, act like men, play sports, do carpentry, which was like very Jesus of them. And they wanted me to do like woodwork. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think you know what you're asking me to do. Anywho, they would ask me to do these, certain activities, or they would push me to perform a certain brand of masculinity. And that was apparently going to change my gender identity. So my gender expression was going to be changed so as to change my gender identity, which would in turn change my sexuality over time, according to this habituated performance that I was required to do. Of course, that didn't happen. Of course, that was not the end result. And thank God it's not. I don't want to be straight. That sounds like a terribly boring life, but who am I? But that was a big part of it, was pushing for this like gender performance. And what they would do would oftentimes, he would ask me about like my victories and my slip-ups. My victories were the things that I had done that week, that I avoided temptation. If I felt like I wanted to look at porn and instead I went for a run, there's a victory. Good job, Luke. You did this, sticker for you. Then there was also the slip-up. So for anything that I did that was not considered sexually pure, that, whether it be looking at a man lustfully, masturbating, pornography, kissing a guy, whatever, that was considered a slip-up, and I had to recount these things to him. And of course, there's like this emotional bond that you have with someone like this that you feel is a trusted authority. He's almost this like father-like figure, grandfather-like figure, actually more so for me. He was quite old by the time I got to him. And, it was this attempt to push me in this direction and change my sexuality. We also like read this conversion therapy manual. I had a manual that was specific. I don't know if all students had this specific manual, but mine was Alan Mettinger's Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey, a lul's title, but whatever. And then we would read this manual, we would pray. He always prayed for me. I never prayed for myself, which of course is, I think speaks volumes that I wasn't able to or spiritual enough to do that work for myself. He had to do it on my behalf. And we would read scripture together and this kind of stuff. And another part too that I for a long time, I didn't talk about, mostly because I had really forgotten about it. But then all of a sudden, when I read another story about this, I have a friend who's written about this, his experience. I was like, oh my God, like I forgot about that. But there was this like big tactile aspect to it. Like he always touched me. And, looking back, like totally creepy and totally weird. But the way I always conceptualized it at the time, even though I did find it bizarre, I didn't love when he did it. But he would like hug me, like these big hugs. And then whenever he would pray for me, he'd put his hand either on my shoulder or on my leg. And like not on my knee, like on my leg, my thigh, bizarre. And I always thought of it as him trying to sort of, what's the word? Show like good touch, bad touch, like to model it like you do for a 4-year-old. And that's what he would do. Like there was this sort of the touchy-feely, handsy aspect to it, which again, looking back, is so bizarre and creepy. But at the time, it felt normal. And of course, evangelicals have no such thing, no conception of personal boundaries. And so you just kind of went with it. You're like, okay, I guess this is what I'm supposed to do, or allow to happen. And those are the main aspects of conversion therapy. And for me, people oftentimes say, like, well, that doesn't sound so bad. Like you were told to sit up straight or you were told to play sports, like get over it. And it's like, well, that's not really how it works. And for me, the violence of conversion therapy, at least in my experience, wasn't in the moment. And I do know people who underwent like electroshock therapy, who went through really intense, grueling, like mental exercises and physical exercises, which thank God were not my experience. But for me, the violence really was years later when I had left Liberty. I was no longer in that bubble. I was no longer a part of this community. I wasn't meeting with him, regularly. I wasn't around other Christians for the most part. Like I only saw my Christian friends like once or twice a week at that point. And I felt unmoored. I felt like I was sort of like now in the world, away from, all these other Christians who I'd been surrounded by for 4 years. And I remember one time I was about to go visit my buddy at the pub and I was standing over my sink and I was doing the dishes and I was crying because I was like, God, I have tried and I have tried and I've tried. I was praying, talking to Jesus or who I thought was Jesus. Turned out to be a voice in my head, but that's again, separate conversation. So I'm standing there crying and praying and I'm saying like, God, like I've tried and I've tried and I've tried. What the hell? Like, what is, why have I not changed? In the evangelical imagination, emphasis on imagination, God is perfect. Right. And if God's perfect and you've tried to change and God wants you to change and God, is the giver of all good gifts, then the problem's not God. The problem is you. Right. And you are the issue. And when you see yourself as a problem, that's when, again, that self-hatred and that shame really kicks in and ignites. And so for me, that was really the violence were the months and years afterwards of experiencing this and coming to realize that I really hated myself in a lot of ways. While also to the entire time not thinking that I did, but again, really sort of becoming cognizant of the fact that I really disdained who I was because I thought it wasn't good enough. And then again, the subsequent undoing and deconstruction of this ideology was of course necessary. But that for me really was my experience of conversion therapy and the violence that happened afterwards.
It's very courageous of you to share your story, and I'm sure you inspired many others who need to hear this. I mean, they try to instill these narratives to convince you there's something wrong with you, or they always say like something happened in your childhood, you were sexually harassed, or you have this complicated bond with your parents, or these narratives and rhetorics that they keep using, but like it's far from reality. And sometimes those who claim they are like ex-gay, supposedly, like they have this extreme internalized homophobia. I feel sad for them. Honestly, I wish them healing and I'll pray for them. So, but it's very tragic. And you mentioned something very beautiful, like if God is perfect and they say we are born in God's image, So if God is perfect and we are born in God's image, if you're trying to change us, it's a direct insult to God. You're making him imperfect. So it doesn't make sense. The math is not mathing, you know. But I appreciate you sharing your journey. I know it might not be easy. And thank you for showing us the beautiful picture of your family on your phone case. It's so adorable. So, and I'm glad like you have a very beautiful bond with your family. And I know despite everything you've been through, you're living your true authentic self, you're expressing yourself. I remember seeing you many times on Toronto Island, on Hanlands, and you were living the best times of your life, embracing your true authentic self. So it was like a testimony of your resilience and a reflection of your courageous spirit to be yourself.
I've never been to Hanlan's before in my life. What are you talking about? No, just kidding.
Oh,
Of
okay,
course.
maybe another request.
No. I love Hanlan's. I think Hanlan's is wonderful, and I think it's, talking about like ways of sort of like working through shame. I think
Uh-huh.
go to the beach, go to Hanlan's Beach
It's
specifically.
my
The
paradise.
queer,
It's my favorite
yeah,
spot in the city. So
same, same.
I agree. So you mentioned two important and deep concepts in the book about religious trauma and moral injury. These were two like new concepts to me. So how does conversion practices lead to this spiritual harm? Can you expand more on that?
Yeah, again, even if you think about what we just talked about, the idea that, if we believe or we are made to believe that God is perfect and God intends or wills for us to be straight, and we're not straight, then, there's this sense of self that is quite negative, and there's the belief that, well, God's not the problem, I'm the problem. And again, when you conceptualize yourself as a problem, like that's, well, to put it simply, a problem. And so much of evangelical theology or Christian theology in general is rooted in shame, right? The idea that every individual is a sinner and needs to be saved by God's grace is bonkers. Like I remember, like I was in my PhD and I was in a class on myth and the Bible, and I was thinking about what I was going to write my final paper on, and I eventually chose to write about Martin Luther and his understanding of Jews, which is a totally different topic. But I thought the other idea that I had was like, has no one ever written about? And I still actually don't know because I didn't go through with the paper. I probably should have gone through this paper because it seems more germane to my research now. But the idea of how Paul, like the Apostle Paul, who was credited with writing a lot of the Christian New Testament, how deeply his entire theology is based on shame, right? Like that all of us are, and again, this is not just Paul, this is also Jesus too, and also God of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians often have to refer to as the Old Testament. This God that needed, in order for there to be any relationship to this God, there needed to be death by sacrifice, right? Like of innocent life, like animals, which is bonkers. And then, of course, Jesus being, the quote unquote substitute for that death or that need for the for sacrifice. All of it's just crazy, right? And all of this is based on and rooted in the idea that humans are depraved, that humans are disgusting and stained and marred and marked by their sin. And so the very like theological underpinnings of Christianity are that humans should be ashamed of who they are, right? There's like even a verse in Isaiah that talks about how like even our righteousness, so even that which is good, even that which we do is righteous, is positive, is of God, is in God's eyes considered what the translation says filthy rags. Filthy rags in the time of Isaiah meant tampons. So in other words, it's like a used bloody tampon, our righteousness. Like, pardon me, like that's how we're supposed to understand ourselves. Like even our goodness is considered like a bloody tampon. And that's the first part. The second part is, of course, within the evangelical tradition or evangelical traditions, Pentecostal, white Christian fundamentalist, and other sort of conservative Christian traditions, again, which is very similar to a lot of other faiths and their understanding of queers, is the idea that queerness is somehow worse than other quote unquote sexual sins. I don't think that queerness is a sexual sin, but here we are. that to be attracted to men and to act upon that attraction is just worse than simply, masturbating, looking at porn, having sex outside of marriage, whatever your quote unquote sexual sin is. And I mean, I remember when I was in high school, there was this one youth leader. She kept going for gay guys. She kept falling in love with these gay men who eventually came out to her and, kept breaking her heart. She should have figured it out, but she didn't. She kept going for these queers. And I remember when she was telling me all this and looking back, it's so curious why she told me this, but whatever, she told me this. And I remember sitting there listening to her, and she said, being gay is just, or however she framed it, if she said sexual, same-sex attraction, whatever it was, she says being gay, let's just say that's what she said, is just so different from all the other sins. Like it's just, and that was not just her saying this. This was something that was a message that was repeated over and over and over. Even my conversion therapist had said that part of his mission was to dispel the idea that queers are worse off or further from God because of their queerness. He didn't say that it was okay to be queer. He really did believe that all sexual sin, quote unquote, was the same, or it's the same in God's eyes. It's all dirty rags or whatever, used tampons before God. But ultimately, that he was trying to dispel this idea. And so when you talk about spiritual harm or spiritual abuse, I mean, you don't even have to talk about conversion therapy. You can talk about simply spirituality within the Christian tradition. But again, if you are to talk about sexuality, certainly it's compounded. Certainly, it is made an issue for queers. And I'm not saying that it's worse per se than all folks. I mean, if you think about purity culture for women and how women are vilified within Christianity, for simply being women, that they're temptresses, but they're also in need of protection. It's this weird sort of saint and slut dynamic that is put onto them. I think that you can see other expressions of evangelical anxieties and fear of sexuality and gender. So I don't want to try to create a hierarchy that it's worse for queers. But it is bad for queers, and it is bad for women. It's bad for, I would argue, also for men who benefit from the system as well. I think it's bad for everyone. But all of these spiritual harms are in relationship to each other and speak to each other and have parallels and similarities, of course, differences as well. But these are all things that I think would fall under the umbrella of spiritual harm.
Honestly, well said. You summed it up very well. Like when these extreme religious ideologies are instilled and forced into you, they only repel you from religion, they repel you from God, and they cause some spiritual harm. And sometimes it's done, like you no longer wanna, you get triggered just hearing the word religion or Bible or Jesus or sing at church. And I'm one of those. So I totally understand. And it was very new concepts to me that I read in the book. So I'm sure the viewers will also enjoy learning about these concepts.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is these sort of words that instill this immediate feeling of anxiety. I mean, and it's so funny, they have so many people within the church who are so at a loss for words for why we actively work against and actively speak against religious harm. Because they of course don't see it as religious harm. They see it as something that's good, and they're just blown away. Like, how could this person who was so involved in the church now so actively work against us? It's like, well, look at what you've done. But of course, so many of these people are blinded to the harm that they're doing, and they think it's ultimately good. They're seen in this upside down world known as Christianity. What is good is seen as bad, and what is bad is seen as good in so many instances. I'm not saying everything, and I don't want to wholesale say that all of their faith is completely death dealing, but a big part of it is, and a big part of it needs drastic revision, if not the garbage. And that's why I do the work that I do, in order to shine a light on these people. Even if the change won't happen, at least there's a light shining on them, maybe for the first time in their lives.
You're doing what you can, and you're sharing awareness, and hopefully the right people will receive the message, and hopefully with an open mind, and eventually a change will happen on a collective level.
Totally.
All right, so reaching to the final question, what message do you hope readers will take away from this book, especially those who may not fully understand the harm of conversion practices?
Hopefully they'll take away the harm of conversion practice. You know what I mean? That is what I hope. I think that, again, I sound so like doomsday or sort of negative Nancy when I say like, oh, I don't think there's going to be much change. And I truly don't think there's going to be much change. However, there is always that one person or those two people, when I think about teaching in the back of the classroom, there's that kid in the back of the classroom, who years later says like, oh, like they'll message you on whatever platform or email you and say like, hey, just so you know, like I'm doing this now and it was because of this class. And I was like, oh, cool. It's not the whole class. In fact, the majority of the class just doesn't give two hoots. They aren't going to listen and they didn't care. However, there is that one or two or three, at best maybe 5 students per class that really care. And in this case, I mean, I hope that there are people who read this book, whether, if it's sitting on someone's coffee table or it's gifted to them or somehow they find it or they're doing research and this is what they come across. I hope that it does change them. I hope that it does give voice to the harms of conversion therapy. Again, is it probable or is it likely that this will really reach the millions and the masses? No. That'd be wonderful. That would also really help with book sales. But I think that whoever this does speak to, that's phenomenal. And whoever is able and willing to change their mind about conversion therapy, that's phenomenal. But I think on top of that, I would also say that I really hope that conversion therapy survivors read this and see themselves in these stories and are able to also, in their own turn, come to terms with what happened to them.
That's a beautiful takeaway message. So I wanted to end it with this quote from your book. By quotation, I realized that this experience, as painful as it was, had solidified something within me, a deep, unshakable conviction in my identity, a resolve to live authentically despite the pressures to conform. And that was in chapter 13. So if you found today's episode inspiring, make sure to share it with a friend who needs to hear this. Make sure to check Luca's book in the link in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe. Until next time. Thank you so much, Lucas, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks, Paul.